You know, I can understand wanting to avoid grinding, I really do. But boy do I get tired of people complaining about it. Like, people will treat any amount of grinding like it's the greatest sin an RPG can commit, sometimes when it may not even be warranted. You may be surprised, or unsurprised, that this discussion is a bit more nuanced than people treat it. Rather than arguing whether grinding in RPGs is a good or bad thing, I want to focus more on how often it's actually necessary versus how much people actually end up grinding. Willingly. On a blind playthrough, games can feel a lot more demanding than they actually are. Obviously, these games don't typically have a set-in-stone way you're supposed to beat them. Rather, the game gives you the available options that can help you get through said obstacles, and it's up to you to figure out how to utilize them to your advantage. I know that sounds like a general hand-wavy defense that could apply to any game ever, but oftentimes it's genuinely true, especially for a lot of the RPGs I see people complain about being grindy. You see, grinding is actually more of a crutch for the first-timer. In a lot of RPGs, yes, grinding is a perfectly viable option. It's also the option that requires the least effort. However, rarely is it ever the only option. I always get a little peeved when people tell me Kanto in Pokemon is too grindy. Not Heart Gold Soul Silver Kanto, like Red and Blue or Fire Red and Leaf Green Kanto. Now, I'm not gonna be one of those people who stresses how easy Kanto is, because a lot of that kinda just comes from multiple playthroughs worth of experience. Like, I remember being stuck at the Elite Four when I was 8. As someone who has played Kanto a billion times, I can attest that there are genuine difficulty spikes. Cerulean City comes to mind for one of them. As soon as you enter the city, you're basically trapped with only two things to do. Either battle your rival at Nugget Bridge, or battle Misty. Now, depending on how you've been playing up to this point, this could be easier or harder. If you've been running a team of 2 Pokemon, you might be a high enough level to handle Misty, especially if you have an Ivysaur. If you're a fool like me who thought just having a Pikachu would have been enough, you're in for a tough time. Sure, Staryu is easy enough, but any Kanto veteran knows that the pressure doesn't really start until Starmie comes out. An extremely strong Pokemon to have this early in the game, for one. For another, Fire Red and Leaf Green improves that Starmie's moveset. Even if you come in with a Pikachu, that Starmie's stats are inflated enough to tank several Thunder Shocks. Water Pulse or Bubble Beam is strong enough to one-shot Pikachu close to her level. Even if you have a Grass type, it now has Swift in Fire Red and Leaf Green for decently strong and unavoidable neutral damage. Now as for the rival, he sounds like the less challenging one on paper, but what kills this fight for a lot of people, including speedrunners, is that he always starts with Pidgeotto. Now, even though Pidgeotto isn't a great Pokemon overall, he sure is powerful for this point in the game. Are you seeing this damage? It also loves to spam Sand Attack, which just completely ruins the fight. You're not landing a single hit. Now obviously there are hard checks for these two problems, but not all players are going to have access to all of them. Not everyone's gonna have Ivysaur. What if the player didn't know that Beedrill's Twin Needle completely shames Misty? What if they didn't train their Geodude for the rival because, it's just kind of a shitty rock that sits there when you first catch it? All signs are pointing towards grinding being the only solution. But wait, what are the odds that you're not going to have the tools to combat either fight? Pretty low, right? Those may be the best options to steamroll these battles, but they're not the only ones to, just complete the fight normally. A lot of people like to run Nidorino here because, as we've established earlier, second stage evolutions are a huge power spike at this point in the game. Some players might be running their own Pidgeotto at this point. Pidgey is a very common encounter straight from the beginning of the game, and it's very commonly used by a lot of beginners. And odds are, yours is probably close to evolving at this point if it hasn't already. There's a rare candy in this guy's backyard just waiting to be used. Are you a quirky player running a Clefairy or Jigglypuff? the extra bulk could help. War of attrition is a valid strategy. Not even saying you have to come with a team stacked with these guys. In fact, spreading your XP among more team members has its own pros and cons. Having more guys to whittle down Misty's team of 2, or just having a couple Pokemon to concentrate all the XP into. Just having even one of the Pokemon I listed trained already can get you through these fights. If you can get past the rival, you'll be able to catch a grass type that could potentially help out against Misty, and there are plenty of trainers up ahead to help you level said grass type. If you beat Misty first, you get a universal defense boost to all your Pokemon that might help you contend with your rival better. The game gives the player plenty to work with before getting to this point. You'd have to be willingly ignoring them to be truly left with no choice but to grind.
Well, they should just design the game so that can't even happen.
Obviously, devs should foolproof games enough to prevent soft locks, but creating an RPG where 0 players will have to grind just isn't feasible. Some players fight more encounters than others, some people fight less. If what you're asking for is a game that's designed to be winnable with only mandatory battles, that's also really fucking lame. It completely trivializes the need for normal encounters, reducing the game down to just a small fraction of its battles. You know how people will do challenge runs of games with only mandatory battles? The whole reason why that's even a challenge is because it goes against the conventions of experience systems in general. The only other way you could possibly execute this idea is by literally giving the player all the best options, or basically screaming in their face to use them. But at that rate, you're just putting the game on training wheels. And they also did that already with Gen 6. It also takes away a lot of player expression when you just give the player a default option to go with. At that rate, it doesn't matter how many other options there are. If you don't incentivize the player to think their way through problems or just be creative with their team, they're not going to. It also drives me crazy when people tell me they need to grind because the Elite Four is so above their level. Trust me, you don't. Remember what I said a little while ago about that defense boost from Misty's badge? This isn't in Gen 4 or onwards, but in the first 3 generations, badge progression gives you invisible increases to your stats. This, on top of the effort values you're gonna be gaining naturally over the course of the game, is supposed to help close the power gap between you and the AI that doesn't have either of these two things. If you've ever wondered why the levels start to creep up so fast towards the end of these games, that's why. Like, this is SMT5 Vengeance levels of generosity when it comes to player-enemy level gaps. So even if you find yourself in a situation where you feel like it would be better to just grind, I guarantee you 99% it won't be nearly as much as you think. And if you are going to grind, please, for the love of God, stop training off wild Pokemon. You stopped needing to do that once they introduced trainer rematches. They give way more XP and you'll level up way faster. And that's without the modern XP share that actually multiplies your XP rather than splitting it. On top of all the other ways the newer games let you gain XP. You gain XP from catching Pokemon. You get a 20% boost to your XP gains if your Pokemon loves you enough. You have XP scaling so that lower level Pokemon can catch up quickly. You have really easily obtainable trade Pokemon pretty much designed to counter upcoming challenges, that also come with an inherent 50% XP boost. I'm not saying you can't theoretically balance a game around having all these things. I'm just saying it's a lot more work to balance a game around what are essentially a bunch of crutches than it is to just balance the game around not having them. It just feels really extra. I feel like the XP scaling alone was perfectly fine, but apparently that's a wild statement in a lot of people's eyes. XP share in Gens 3 through 5 was perfectly fine. It splits the XP between the Pokemon that defeats the opponent and the Pokemon holding the XP share. It comes at the cost of half your active Pokemon's XP, which prevents them from getting over-leveled, and at the cost of a held item slot. It's a crutch, but there's still some incentive to send the rookie out for full XP if you're confident that they can handle it. I was originally going to make this video all about experience sharing in RPGs, but someone else already made a really good video about it. The guy in the video said something that really stuck with me, that just kinda sums up this whole section.
Now you might say that these games shouldn't make any player have to grind, but I don't think designing any game around the people in the worst case scenario should be the norm. It is a far more worthwhile experience for everyone if there is some challenge, even if a few players are left to grind. A game asking players to evolve as the game evolves itself isn't a bad thing, it's just proper game design.
Link in the description. Upon replaying a game, you'll notice that you might have been able to get past certain choke points a lot easier than before. Maybe you were able to skip out on huge grinds from your last playthrough altogether. I remember spending way more time grinding than I needed to in Final Fantasy IV. For those of you unaware, the Pixel Remaster actually reduces the amount of XP needed to level up, so if you thought the game wasn't that hard, that's probably why. If you've played the Super Nintendo, GBA, or PSP versions, you might remember being at this part of the game. Your main story objective is to go to the Sealed Cave, but you also have two other optional dungeons open to you. There's a bit of a dilemma though. These trapdoors will target party members with an instant death spell and summon another monster to burn you to death. The best solution to this is for Rosa to learn the Reflect spell. The trapdoors will always indicate who they're targeting, so you can just cast Reflect on that one party member, instantly defeating the doors. However, there's a good chance you might not be at that level if you choose to do that dungeon first. Then there are the other two dungeons, the Feymark and the Sylph Cave. These two dungeons have damage floors, which can be mitigated by casting Float on your party. But again, you're likely gonna be a couple levels short. It might be tempting to grind for one or both of those spells, and that's what I did on my first playthrough. Nowadays though, I can recognize that this is likely intentional. The game wants you to contend with the damage floors for at least a little bit before being able to just completely eliminate the problem at the press of a button. I usually end up doing the Sylph Cave first. Something worth noting about older versions of the game is that equipping something that blocks just one status ailment will completely nullify the dreaded Marlboro's bad breath attack, which is supposed to inflict a bunch of them. While this doesn't solve all your problems, it does make the Sylph Cave much more manageable to traverse. Over the course of looting the dungeon and fighting encounters naturally, you'll eventually reach the levels needed to learn both Float and Reflect. The new kick-ass equipment and extra spells make the remaining two dungeons more manageable as well. Float makes traversing the Feymark less annoying, the Mage Masher knife deals great damage to Asura, the Avenger Sword is just an all-around great weapon for Kain at this point in the game, and Reflect takes care of the trapdoors in the Sealed Cave. Just make sure to take the Avenger off Kain before leaving the dungeon. Characters tend to come and go as they please in this game. Another one of my favorite games that's often considered grindy is Persona 3. Not so much with grinding for bosses, I found this game is actually really flexible with how you can go about finding solutions for Tartarus Guardians. Take Intrepid Knight for example. People rave about how you need to be level 20 so you can fuse Narcissus to win. You don't. You have a perfectly good Fortuna at level 17 with wind resistance, an attack debuff, and ice spell that can damage the boss. Did you really need to grind a level 46 for Sleeping Table, or did you actually just need to stack up on HP boosting equipment and have the protagonist play a supportive role? People tend to underrate the offensive capabilities of the party members. Sure, the protagonist is better at dishing out damage, but you wanna know what else he's better at? Heal and support. It's way better to have a protagonist who can alternate between these roles, and consequently, make the combat and party composition more interesting. Honestly, most of the grind comes from keeping all your party members caught up on XP. Early on, it's not that bad, but later on when you have to juggle 8 different party members, it does become a little tricky finding room to swap a party member in for their share of the XP. If you're smart with how you divvy up the XP though, you'll likely only need to spend a little extra time catching one character up. Keep in mind that XP is split between active party members, and XP scaling is in effect. So if you go into Tartarus shredding through encounters with only the protagonist and one other character, they'll catch up pretty quickly. If you would like to help me with the YouTube grind, consider subscribing. It really does help push these videos into the algorithm and it's free. You can also support me on Patreon for $1. It really goes a long way. Now back to the video. Okay, so I've been saying you don't have to grind nearly as much as you think, but how much grinding is too much grinding? Some people are more tolerant of grinding than others. Some people will say, an hour's not bad. Others will act like any amount of grinding whatsoever is a war crime. Like they'll cry if they have to grind 2 levels to learn a spell. I can't speak for everyone, so I'll just tell you my own standards for what I consider excessive. So have you guys ever played this little game called Dragon Quest I? Yeah, we're starting with low-hanging fruit here. I'm not talking about the remake, by the way. If you've played the NES, SNES, or Game Boy versions of this game, you'll know what I'm talking about. Despite being a very short game, it's also probably one of the grindiest I've ever played. Every boss is a level check to make sure you have a specific spell. Every equipment purchase costs an organ, so you'll end up cheaping out and skipping on a few shops. It embodies the worst practices of grindiness within a shorter amount of time than most other RPGs. So, in case there was any shadow of a doubt, yes, a shorter game can be more grindy than a long one. Spreading out grinding isn't even a bad thing. If you spread out your grinding in quick short strides, and keep it down to a minimum, it's perfectly fine. Digital Devil Saga comes to mind. To learn skills, you master mantras by devouring your enemies, earning you Atma points. Essentially a second form of experience. That alone kinda leads people to believe this game is grindy, but not really. As long as you make it a habit to eat opponents instead of killing them the normal way, and carry lots of disaches to get rid of stomach aches, you can pretty reasonably gain enough AP to learn a sufficient amount of abilities. Just focus each party member towards a specific role and choose your mantras around that. There are mantras you can master to get passive karma, that's your normal level XP, but Atma points are far more important. Having a dedicated food tank character to share the AP across your party is where you should invest first. Karma is easy enough to divvy up if you're switching your party members around evenly. You only have 5 party members and an active party of 3 in these games, so it shouldn't be that hard. Karma sharing kinda becomes an afterthought. Super boss territory is another story. That is just a 10-hour grind to master all the right mantras and get to level 99. The game goes from having very minimal grinding to the grinding taking up the majority of your playtime. Now, I don't have the time to get into a long tangent on how super bosses should be integrated into a game. All I will say is that DDS has demonstrated both extremes of just right and too much grinding. But that's just grinding for experience. People are actually way more tolerant of grinding than you think. Let's get into the other types of grinding that are debatably even grindier. You know, despite how short Sonic games tend to be, people love to grind these games. And they're designed to be too. In games like Sonic Adventure 2, you're definitely not going to A-rank these stages without replaying them. Mastering the level design and letting the physics become second nature to you. You know what else? It's not just the stages you played in your initial playthrough. Every stage has 5 missions that you also need to optimize. It's undeniable, this is a grind. And if you plan on doing the Chow Garden stuff, you're definitely grinding. This is just the norm for Sonic fans. Are you even a real Sonic fan if you don't replay the same stages over and over again? Sonic fans love grinding their games more than RPG players grind RPGs. This is what I like to call grinding for mastery. Come to think of it, pretty much any game that has a ranking system or time attack mode kinda lends itself to grinding. And unlike RPGs, the incentive is built in. The door will always be open for better optimization until every stage has that highest rank mark next to it. The goal of Sonic games isn't just to clear the story. The game makes it apparent right from the beginning, upon seeing that E rank the first time you clear a stage. They want you to master this game. In fact, platformers are at their most fun when you take the time to master them, even outside of having a ranking system. That's why the guy who has played Mario 64 1,000 times will love the game infinitely more than the guy who just thought it was okay on their first run, and then didn't feel that much better about it after giving it a second chance. Now you might argue that the process of mastering a level is more interesting and engaging than simply gaining stats just to stand a fighting chance. But I'd argue that this is just as applicable to RPGs as it is to platformers. This is actually another reason why people make grinding more tedious for themselves than they have to. They continuously bash their heads into the same encounters over and over without utilizing the tools they have, thus prolonging the grind longer than they need to. You could discover enemy weaknesses that you didn't know about before. Maybe you could have turned that really tough enemy into a toad this whole time and made the fight a lot easier. You could start to learn the most MP efficient way to handle certain encounters to conserve your resources. Just the general idea of discovering properties of the game you might not have been aware of stays consistent between both these genres. Next, let's talk about grinding for the goods. So basically every live service game ever. People will grind these games for that in-game currency just to buy a new skin. So imagine what I said earlier about grinding in Dragon Quest 1, except all the equipment was just cosmetic stuff. Now, I'm not shaming anyone for doing this, single-player RPGs can have this too, and I'm not above going out of my way to farm for a specific outfit for a character. There's no real functional benefit for doing this. We do it because the costume looks cool or funny, or maybe purely because it's rare. You should check out my video on rare item drops if you haven't yet. The rule of cool is a very real thing. It doesn't matter if Ultimate Weapon isn't technically the best, people will still use it because it's cool. It's ultimate. The same thing applies to that Fortnite skin. It doesn't matter if it doesn't really amount to anything. It's freaking Hatsune Miku! And hell, some people just like having cool cosmetics to flex. It gives off an aura of seniority around here. You want to let your opponent know they're not just playing against a chump. Does it actually prove you're good at the game? No, just that you play the game a lot. But that's enough to convince some people you're good at the game. I don't think there's much point in asking whether this or grinding for XP is a bigger waste of time. At the end of the day, it just comes down to how worth it is to the player. All that said, now let's talk about the ways that grinding can be good. As I mentioned earlier, there's the angle of just getting better at the game overall. In games with less conventional mechanics especially, grinding can be good practice or a chance to sorta study the way certain mechanics work, or certain behaviors of enemies, or even your own party members. Not just in the sense of figuring out their unique abilities. Returning to Persona 3 as an example again, this game is kinda infamous for the way it handles party members. Rather than the traditional manual input from the player, the protagonist gives allies more general directives, and your party will behave based on those. It sounds daunting, but this is where the long-winded nature of the dungeon excursions actually helps. In short, Persona 3 has a stamina system that makes it harder for you to complete the dungeon block in one sitting. The game clearly wants you to spread your excursions over the course of multiple in-game days, and even leaves ample time to grind if you really need to. As you can imagine, grinding can actually be a useful tool to get inside your party's heads, and figure out how they operate or how specific tactic commands work. You can narrow down what skills a character can or cannot use under which setting, as well as what conditions will prevent them from performing actions they would normally do. If they're using status ailments after you scanned the enemy is probably susceptible to it. The protagonist being able to build personas better around landing ailments might have a better shot at it, but party members can signal to the player when it might be appropriate to try them. To use a more traditional example, let's return to Final Fantasy IV. Did you know the behemoth in Final Fantasy IV doesn't actually do anything? Not on its own, at least. The behemoth only counterattacks. Sure, it's a strong enemy, but you can recuperate from its onslaught pretty easily, and it won't put up any resistance unless you attack it first. This can push you to try and maximize damage while minimizing the number of attacks landed. It also means you can slow down and take your time with this monster rather than rushing to kill it. Or hell, even in action RPGs, the grind-to-learn approach can help. That one enemy that always gives you trouble could end up having an Achilles heel you didn't know about. The Berserkers in Kingdom Hearts 2 are big, intimidating enemies with catastrophic damage potential, but you might notice that they drop their weapons when they get staggered. How do you get them to stay in that staggered state though? It's kinda hard to take advantage of when there are a bunch of them going after you at once. Their weakness? Chicken Little. Yeah, no joke. Chicken Little can gather enemies towards himself and keep them staggered while doing it. This leaves them open to either get incinerated by fire, or just nabbing one of their claymores to wipe them all out in one swoop. On the less technical side of things, grinding is also just a very cozy pastime. Like, one of the best investments you can ever make as a gamer is buying a second monitor. Put some dungeon chill in the background. Normally, I like to give long-form videos my full attention, but if the grinding is very streamlined, I can definitely give enough of my attention to the video to do it simultaneously. I can't really explain it, but there's just something really therapeutic about sitting in your dimly lit room wandering around an oppressive atmospheric dungeon with no other goal than to just slay some monsters, build up funds, or complete some downtime side quests if you're a real go-getter. It's not necessarily fun in the sense that it's some high-octane, engaging activity, but thankfully I wasn't born after the year 2000, so I don't need constant dopamine to get enjoyment out of a game.
Whoa! Joke! That was a joke!
As someone who has trouble concentrating on tasks, I find that grinding is actually one of the few things where I'm able to lock in, as the kids say, and commit to meeting a few select goals at a time. And I don't know, progress is still progress, even if it's not the plot that's progressing. And again, like I said earlier, there are definitely limits to this. I just think that instead of dismissing grinding as a whole as some relic of the past, we should acknowledge that in a lot of cases, it's largely just a crutch, or maybe even a last resort for the unprepared player. The only way to truly remove grinding from a game entirely is to either A, normalize completing every side quest for the XP, which not everyone will want to do, or B, lower the skill requirement for RPGs overall. This leads to a less satisfying experience for the larger sum of players. The thing is, I think modern RPGs already do a good job with streamlining the grinding process. Most RPGs with field encounters will give you an instant win if you out-level the enemy enough. The solution isn't to try and eliminate any scenario where someone might have to grind. Rather, the best RPGs out there give you a variety of options to work with, and just let the player do the best they can with them. And if it really comes down to it, I don't think gaining a few levels will kill you.